Hey everyone, welcome to my YouTube page. This video is a recording from a live workshop painting demonstration I did of a split complementary colour study. I know the recording footage didn't turn out great, but the content is still good. I've added a lot of extra footage from my tutorial platform and from the early stages of this painting to make up for the poor footage, so I know you will still enjoy the video. I cover a lot of information in this workshop, not just colour theory, but also lessons that I teach in my online tutorial platform. I go way beyond the painting itself and hold nothing back. So sit back and enjoy. I will see you at the end of the video. Tonight I'm going to be teaching you a very basic but quite a powerful split complementary colour study, which is applicable across the board, whether you're wildlife, still life, portraiture. It's just basic colour manipulation to create a really vibrant painting using like 5 colours. And so I kept it simple for the sake of tonight, but it's also a lesson that I'm going through with my online subscribers. So it's applicable for everyone. I'll be focusing on Maimeri Puro as a brand of oils for tonight. I came across the brand thanks to Lynette, who is the Canson rep for Australia. She sent me an email and said, hey, would you like to try this paint? I said, sure. I didn't expect much from it because I get a lot of review requests from brands, and I fell in love with the paint because it's really beautiful to use in terms of its consistency versus brilliance. A lot of paints, particularly oil paints, can be very thick, which I'm sure that you might know from experience. And I found that the main point of difference for Maimeri Puro was its consistency was very smooth, and I didn't have to add a lot of medium to it, so the brilliance was still very high for the ease of spread. So I do like the paint. They're not paying me to like the paint. This is just a passion of mine. This is actually the view outside my studio window. A little bit has been massaged into place. So if you are familiar with the Silver Sands region, it might look a little bit different, but this is essentially the view outside my window. And I'm using a colour workshop from this book. I don't know if Leighton stocks it, but he might be able to get it in. Maybe. Look into it. Yeah. Otherwise, it's available on Amazon. It is a wonderful colour theory book that teaches some really great fun exercises, and tonight's one is based off of some lessons from this book. So I highly recommend that one if you don't have it already and want to expand your colour knowledge. And so I am a self-taught artist, so a few disclaimers here. I tend to use really simple terminology for technical processes and concepts. So wherever it's applicable and where I remember to do it, I will use both layman's terms for things as well as the technical terms. So split complementary colours are essentially using 3 closely related colours, each colour having a part of the other colour in it, ensuring that it will be a harmonious colour to the eye. So my main colour choice are my warm oranges, which is actually from a lemon yellow to a light cadmium, red and cadmium orange, which is then complemented by one colour on the opposite side of the colour wheel. So the opposite side is actually a cool purple. So for this one, I've created a cool purple using Cobalt Blue and Dioxazine purple, which is Violet Lake in the Maimeri Puro range. So we cooled down the Violet Lake using a bit of Cobalt Blue, and that is the perfect complement to the orange cadmium, which is directly across it in the colour wheel. If you have any experience with colour wheels, this is something that is really easy to follow. And if you don't have experience with a colour wheel, I highly recommend printing one off, because this will help you to narrow down your colour choices when you're choosing what to put on your palette. So the complementary tone is used as a pure accent or hinted at in a more neutralised manner to provide colour balance. All these colours can be used in a lighter or darker value by adding white or black, and neutralising it by adding the complement. So I have used the cool blue and purples in this painting to create shadow tones, as well as some cool highlights, especially in the mountain range, and then where the shadows can be sort of guessed at throughout the painting. So it also creates the balance between the huge amount of warm tones and bright sunny tones that I've got with the oranges and yellows to create that harmony. And it creates a real vibrant palette without having an overly complex color system. So it's literally 5 colors. I have a lemon yellow, a cadmium orange, and I'll hold this palette up, and a cadmium red. Mine is a medium, but you can use a light, whatever works for you, what you've got in your palette. And then on this side, I've got my Violet Lake and my Cobalt Blue, which I mixed together to create my lighter tones on this side. I've got titanium white in there, which I'm not sure counts as a color, so you could say it's a 4-color palette with a tint. You can add black to it if you want to. I haven't used black because I haven't found that I need to. I've been able to create those darker values for the shadows in the trees just using the Dioxazine purple and red. And that's created the real grounding tones for it. So basically, the initial stages of this painting was to mimic a real light, even spread, almost like a watercolor texture with the painting itself. So I prepared the palette using the Maimeri Puro Glazing medium mixed with solvent and a little bit of the clear oil medium. So the reason between each is because I needed to create a lean medium, so a base that was going to dry really quickly that I could then layer on top of fairly quickly afterwards. So the glazing medium mixed with the solvent is a very fast drying medium. It is therefore a lean medium, and I added the clear oil to it to slow that down because the clear oil has no fast drying agents in it. It's what you would call a fat medium. And so having the fat medium in the lean slowed it down a little bit, because as soon as you start spreading that lean medium out on the surface of the painting, it starts to oxidize and dry out. So I covered the entire surface of this panel, which is the ampersand gesso board. So it's already primed, smooth as anything, ready to go. And there's no texture coming through from that surface. It is just as pretty much smooth as you could ever hope to make a gesso board. And I basically spent 20 minutes just washing. It was mostly lemon yellow and cadmium orange in the top with hints of the purple coming in to create that shadow at the top. And then it just faded out to basically a light wash of the lemon yellow, and then I added some titanium white to get a little bit more opacity in that paint. Throughout the bottom, if you hop onto YouTube, you'll be able to see I created like a streaky base to work on using a neutral orange. So I mixed my cadmium orange with a little bit of the dioxazine purple, and where they meet basically creates a neutral version of that color. So when you neutralize a color on your palette, you need to use a color from the opposite side of the color wheel, and that will create a perfect complement and therefore neutralize the color itself on the palette, and therefore will create a really nice. So for example, this is a neutralized orange in here. So it's a very soft, muted version of the color, which is great for creating vibrant shadows. So not giving you a somber shadow, but a really vibrant, warm tone. And you can do the same with highlights if you want to avoid high chroma colors. Just neutralize that color. So the chroma of a color is the intensity of that color. So for example, a high chroma subject is like lemons and oranges. They're a high chroma color. And so when you want to neutralize that or add a bit of a shadow to that element without losing the vibrance of the painting, you add a color that is its exact complement. So you look on your color wheel and you go directly across and mix that together, and you'll create a complement, and that will neutralize that color on the palette. Then you're able to create these really nice, soft, gentle tones that are harmonious for the eyes. And so after I created that background, it was dry. like it already started getting sticky within the first half an hour. So once it starts to get sticky, you've got to stop, because otherwise you're going to create these ripples of paint as you pull the paintbrush across. I did the initial layer using a mop brush. So it's basically the same way that you would work with watercolors to create that even wash across the background. You use a highly absorbent mop brush of some kind to really pull that paint across and create that flow of paint. And then by the morning, it was good to go. Touch dry, even hard underneath pressure. So I was then able to start applying some blocking in layers, which I used basically a lot of guesswork for. I started at the back and then basically just worked my way forward in the landscape. I used obviously some blues in the back to create the haze, and then started adding the line of trees, and then started working essentially from the dark tones up. I've just found for my process that dark to light reduces the amount of muddying in the colours, especially when working alla prima and sectioning each colour. So trying to see it as a paint by numbers that you can then come in and blend over, which is what I'm going to demonstrate tonight as well with this half of the painting. So I've essentially finished this half of the painting, and I'll be doing that to this side. So there's only 2 applications of colour to this painting. The first layer consisted of this blocking in, which is just basic tones up to the stage where I felt like there was too much paint and it was starting to really blend with each stroke that I made. I couldn't get a crisp application of a new colour whenever I was ready to apply it. And so that's when I just stop and I let it get touch dry, which with the Maimeri Puro I found is within about 24 to 48 hours, depending on how thick and the weight of the pigment. So the heavier the pigment, such as titanium white, the longer it will take to get touch dry, whereas when it is a lighter pigment or more transparent, usually the darker pigments, they're usually touch dry within 24 hours. The biggest key point I can make with doing these initial layers is to try and work in opaque tones. So creating color mixes that don't rely on pure pigments that might be more transparent in nature. So I wouldn't do a color with purely burnt umber, for example, which is a very transparent pigment. It's great for glazes, but not so great for these initial blocking in layers. So when you're blocking in, try and keep your colors more opaque. They can range from dark to light mid-tones. I have created a little value scale over there, which you can have a look at later, where I've played around with my favorite tan tone color mixture for my wildlife paintings, and basically anywhere along that scale where you've got a color mix that has an opaque mixture in it, so whether it's titanium white or you've got a raw sienna or a pigment that has on the scale of the tube, it's got a reading about how transparent or opaque the color is. The more opaque the color is, the more solid your mix will turn out to be. The more transparent, obviously, the harder it will be to block in using those colors, because they will just blend and show through all the different colors that you're mixing. So in this initial blocking in stage, I do try to focus on more opaque color mixes, and then I bring in my glazes in a stage like today where I can focus on my darker tones and blending those in to create those really soft glazes where it graduates from dark to light in a seamless way without muddying any other colours. So I hope that that made sense. Does anyone have any questions before I begin pulling out paint and probably getting paint everywhere? No questions. Well, I guess that's good. I'll go over my materials. It's a very simple setup. I'm just worried about visual. I will try and move out of the way so that you guys can see the painting. Basically, and I better not move it because my cameraman will tell me not to. I've got in my handy dandy sealable, which you can get here, which I got here actually. This is my solvent. I don't use it to thin down my paints. It's more for my brushes than anything, and I leave that sealed because it gives me a headache. So I leave that sealed throughout the painting process and just use it to get paint off my brush. I used to use linseed oil for that process because it was a lot kinder to the bristles, but efficiency and time I use solvent, so you can use either or, whatever works best for your practice. Obviously using solvent makes it more toxic, so when you have allergies and things get a little bit more tricky that way, you can opt for a pure oil like a linseed, and then you can avoid using toxic chemicals. So I use the Maimeri Puro glazing medium and the clear oil. This one is probably my new favorite medium, and I was telling Lynette about it and she didn't realize what I could use it for. So when I'm working on a large scale painting, especially on canvas or linen or textured board in some way, applying a new layer of paint to the surface of the painting, like quite passionately, can be annoying because it has so much surface tension. So I do a layer of the clear oil, which is the same principle as oiling out, without needing to dilute it with solvent or wipe it off. It's like adding a layer of clear paint to the surface of the painting, and so you get that wet on wet feel with your paint as you apply it without getting the muddying of colours. So that was just a favourite of mine, which I was thrilled that Lynette didn't know anything about. So I put that on my palette because I use it to thin down the paint as well, especially in the last layers that I'm doing for this workshop, because it is obviously a fat medium. I don't need it to dry quickly. The slower the better, really, in some cases for the final layers. And it just makes the paints really, really smooth. So I will hold my palette so that I can show you around the room what I'm doing. And I've basically got all the colours that I need for this. So as I said before, I've got my cadmium red medium, which is just what I had in the studio in the Maimeri range. You can use cadmium light. It has a cooler and more of an orange tone. So for the split complementary, for the analogous side, so the analog is a group of colours that are very similar. They're in the same, very closely related, in the same family on the colour wheel. And so we've got the orange range, so the more orange red, and I've gone for a light yellow, which gives me that brilliance, rather than the darker cadmium yellow medium. And then I've got my cool ranges. This is just a simple mixture. It's quite peachy in finish. This is the cadmium orange with a little bit of the dioxazine purple in it, the violet lake. And it's sort of, I'm slowly working towards the more neutral. So for this side today, I'm going to be adding from the back through to the foreground a little bit more light, a little bit more detail, and then I will be grounding the horizon line. So like I've done on this side, I've added shadow to the bases of the trees and light to the top, to the back, just creating a sort of a misty feel to the horizon line, essentially, in this painting. This stage now is completely imaginative because we have very, very bright light. We don't get that real soft, hazy feel where we are. So this is now me just creating and romanticizing of the view out my window. And we've got a neighbour with some very not so aesthetic old sheds that would probably be out over here, which I've left out. And I have included wildlife, for those who know that I paint wildlife. They're over there in the distance. They're little, but they're there. So I've separated the composition and I've focused on my lower third just to create the balance. The shadow is in the foreground to create the weight at the front, in the foreground of the painting, rather than having it too far back and too close to the center. So the eye leads into the painting rather than starting in a random place in the middle and getting lost. I hope by the end of it, it will have that feel anyway. So basically, I'm going to flounder between lights and darks. And because I'm past that blocking in stage, my process of going from dark to light is sort of becoming a little bit more loose, and it depends on the area and the effect that I'm trying to create. So I am going to switch over to This one is a flat, Princeton Aspen flat. It is a stiff synthetic. The longer bristle I've found easier to work with in this setting anyway for creating the detail and doing so. Most of this has been done with this flat. I've avoided using my favoured round size 0, which is what I would usually opt for when doing my details, simply because these elements are really quite straight, and I will end up creating curves when I blend the layers in. So I'm basically going to be working in a format of glazes, even with my opaque colours, which I'm going to be glazing into the mountains and the background. So creating a fine mist and dry brushing that into the layers as I go. So I'm going to start with bringing the light behind the trees and bringing in a few of those elements to create a little bit more space between the tones of the grass and what you would see in a landscape underneath the trees, and you have the light coming through. So I'm just going to add a little bit more fluidity. I don't want it too fluid because I want there to still be a little bit of traction in the paint. And I'm not too sure how I'm going to be putting my back to you. I'm so sorry. You can jump on YouTube and watch when I created this side. You're essentially seeing that. So it is going to be a very fine layering here. It's a very gentle, not a lot of pressure on the brush. And I'm going to allow these tones at the back to show through. And I'm basically just placing shapes with my brush, because most of the effect that you see on this side is created through a dry brushing hazing that I do with a shorter bristle brush that gives me that stiffness that I need to really push paint around the panel. And so I'm going to create the tops, the shapes, the tops of the trees, which I'm literally just making up in my head as I go. I want this to be a slightly more opaque version, so I'm not really allowing a lot of those underlayers to show through. A lot of artists refer to this stage as my repainting phase. So you spend a lot of time repainting what you've already created, because each layer is a way of getting to know your painting. So if you spend some time repainting, I never consider that as lost work. It's more just progression in the understanding of the artwork. The more layers you do, actually, the more depth you're able to achieve. So I'm actually going to fade that light out a little bit. Bring it into the mountains a little bit. So at the bottom, I'm just going to crouch in front so everyone can see. So I've started bringing in some light through here. And when you start creating the division in the horizon line, you can create more depth. And this is sort of where you can really start bringing texture. So like you can use the texture of the brush and create that scattering of light across the surface of the field and all those sorts of things. And then here, where the colours are more blocky, to get them to that stage, there'll be 3 applications of colour. So there's more orange and more of those dark in there. So I will include more of these yellows and create some more space between the trees. And create a few dapples of light coming through. And this will all just be blended in. So when we're talking about split complements, you can see that as soon as you start applying the warm over the cool, you're creating light and dark. And you haven't exactly gone for a low value of the colour. It's just the way that the complements play off one another, which is really fun, I find anyway, to see it come to life. And if I'll just skip a step to the blending part. So like what I've got here, I've gone for a shorter bristle. If you're doing a larger, I think I used this one actually, the larger brush. So this one is the short bright, and it's a much stiffer brush. And so I basically just rub over the top of it and blend that through. So I'm still showing, so it's essentially like a glaze where you show the layers coming through and you create that hazy effect. So usually when you see things in the distance, they get lighter. And so getting rid of these very dark pops of colour that I've placed at the base of the hills will help to increase that perception of depth. And it just had to wait until the second application of colour so that I was able to do this. I tend to do a lot of soft focus work, especially with my wildlife. A lot of wildlife imagery has a soft focus background, and so creating these effects becomes quite important to getting that clarity in the impact of the painting itself. So once I've started spreading that colour out, I can come in with some more of the colour, and I found you can actually apply quite a few layers in this initial alla prima stage because the paint itself doesn't have to be so thick to create that vibrant, brilliant colour. So you can apply more paint to it in this initial stage. Just get rid of some of those darker tones down here. So a lot of this paint on this side is still quite wet because I just did it yesterday. And it would be massaged a little bit as you sort of start layering. So I'm just creating the tops of the trees, the shapes, just out of my imagination. Probably completely wrong from this angle. It looks all right. And the real kicker for this section comes with those grounding tones where you've got those darker values coming in. And I'm just going to get rid of my light tones. If anyone has any questions, please feel free.
This lady has a
Yeah.
the oil that you said that you used
Yeah.
to prep the oil.
Mm-hmm.
Is it only good for oil texture, or do other mediums work with it as well?
Like in terms of getting that same effect with other mediums?
Yeah, if you were using acrylic or even pan pastels?
Yep, so I wouldn't use an oil-based medium with any water-based paints. So acrylic I wouldn't use it with. To get that effect with acrylic, I'd probably use a retarder or even a self-leveling medium to create that smooth layer to then start applying paint on top of. Sorry?
That would be gesso, I suppose.
So gesso would be the original layer. Yeah. So if you wanted to create this smooth effect, you'd probably need to apply like 6 to 8 layers of gesso and lightly sand in between each layer. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if you've had anything to do with ink tanks, pencils, but I do work on fabric.
Yep.
And I was just wondering, would something like that be good prepped on there first to do it?
I probably wouldn't do an oil-based medium with pencils, mostly because the surface.
The other one you were talking about.
Oh, the self-leveling medium. I haven't tried it. You could. I would definitely give it a go. I know that pencils do require a little bit of texture to grip onto in order to create layers, especially. A self-leveling medium is very smooth in finish. You could probably rough it up with some rough sandpaper, but it's probably going to be a little bit more headache
It'd be different
than reward.
using that on canvas to fabric, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It would be, for sure. Yeah, you're welcome. So I'm just going to use a little bit of my purple, which is a very bright purple. It's quite cool. And then I'm going to use a little bit of my cadmium red, and I tend to start mixing them separately and bring them together so that I'm not using up a lot of paint to like go back and forth between color mixes and hopefully get it right in that one sitting. So this creates, because of those complementary colors, so we've neutralized both of them at the same time, creating a shadow tone. And because they are almost exact complements, you're creating quite a beautiful, harmonious color to work with. It's not muddy and it's got a lot of depth to it. So it's still a vibrant color rather than a muted, dark, deep, somber color. And I'm slowly starting to understand how important color really is when you're creating beautiful artwork. So I'll go down again and hopefully everyone can see. Going to basically apply this to the base of what I would think would be the trees. And just dab it around the place. I'm just going to get more and more of this paint now that I know sort of the balance that I want. And just make it a little bit smoother with my medium. I'll try hold it up. I'm so sorry everyone over there. And I'm basically just dabbing lines that might imply the trees. And I want to start bringing in some shadow and create some grounding marks as well. So a lot of these will end up being blended. If you notice that you've picked up, by the way, like I did here, any color from previous layers, it's just a matter of just cleaning the brush off if you've got paper towel or something. And then you can just dab over the top. And basically just fill the lines that you want, the marks, to create those shadows in the trees. And so now that we've got a lot of blotchy marks, I'm going to bring in a smaller brush and I'm going to push these into the lighter marks and create that sort of soft fade effect that you get in your shadow tones when you go from dark to light. So rather than trying to do this with one solid color mixture blending into the other, I'm just pushing them into the panel, essentially rubbing it in, and that's creating a glaze. And so I don't have to worry too much about the blending because that just happens without much effort. It just goes straight into those lower layers. And so now I want to bring in lighter tones to make this area pop again. And I'm going to use a more mid-range value, which should be my oranges. So my orange is going to be a lighter, sort of neutralized, slightly neutralized orange. Just need to clear this brush. Should have bought more than one. That's okay. So my neutralized orange is basically just a lower chroma version of my orange, my cadmium orange. So I'm going to use a little bit of purple in that, but with titanium white as well to bring that forward. So even though it is slightly neutralized, it's a lighter version. So I'm just making that value a little bit lighter and easier to see. So it's catching more light. So it's basically, because it's a direct complement, we're not getting a muddying of this color. It's just muting it ever so slightly. So we're not dealing with oversaturation in the colors. it allows that hazy effect. It's almost a little bit peachy in colour and finish, but it's basically going to be what we need to just sort of catch the light on the tops of the trees. So I'm going to apply it close to the top. And I'm more using the flat of the brush for this. And I will come in again and blend these all together to create that very soft look to the trees. And having a change, like I'm doing everything fairly similar across the board here, but when it comes to the landscapes, you can change it up as much as you want. It doesn't have to be same. So I do encourage this exercise because it is a lot of fun. There's a lot of freedom in it. And it's a great learning process along the way. So the key is not to overwork these tones at this stage, because once you start overworking it, you can get caught in a cycle of not getting it right, and so you keep working, and then you keep not getting it right, and so you keep going to try and get it right, and it just ends up in a loop. So as soon as colours start to appear muddy, just stop, just let it go. You can lift the colours. Thankfully with oil paint you don't have to just simply repaint it. You can actually fill your brush with solvent and scrape the paint up off the surface of the canvas and then just simply start again if need be, which is fantastic. I've done that a few times in this painting. And so basically it's just a matter of adjusting these tiny little marks as you go to create whatever effect you want. And I'll get into a few more technical sides of, if you're interested at all, wildlife painting and layering and how I would go about creating different effects for fur and feathers, if you're interested in that. Yeah. All right. So basically, I don't know if that's actually done anything, but it kind of, you can start creating the sense of light and dark in the background just through just the use of those colours. And you've got the depth through the trees now. And I left this section out a little bit so that you've got sort of the point of reference between the two. And I've used some dark marks for the posts rather than opting for light, just because it gives those definite points throughout the landscape. I found that it can get a little bit easy to just, if there's a lot of light, there could be too much light. So dark marks I just don't know, I like them. And basically it would just now be created through a lot of fiddling through colours and layers, but using those principles you can then take a very simple, albeit can be boring, view, and yeah, create something beautiful. A very simple palette. As you can tell, it's not a lot of colour mixing. A lot of the mixing that I do with such a simple palette just happens between the exact colours, and there's a value scale that happens that way, so you can take out between those value scales. And so I will talk a little bit about my wildlife work and the layering process that I use there. When we finish tonight, and you can get up and obviously try some of the samples and have a look. At the front here, I have a few of the demonstrations that I've done on the Canson canvas paper, and they've been demonstrations of things like using cool and warm values colours to create white tones. These are the base layers of what would eventually be a white swan's wing. And the main process with that is creating a warm base against cool highlights. So white tones are especially tricky to work with. I don't know if anyone has tried painting anything white, like a white sheet. But a lot of the issues that I found when painting with white is creating clean highlights against clean shadow tones. And the best way that I've found with that is using cool and warm greys. And the colour tones, the colours that I've used, I've listed here. A very simple colour palette, again, only 5 colours. Usually off the top of my head, Payne's Grey, Raw Umber, Raw Sienna, Alizarin Crimson, Ultramarine Blue and Titanium White. So the top 3 will create your cools, Alizarin Crimson and Ultramarine Blues. So you're using purple and purple blues against very strong, warm, often orange tone greys, like it's a little, there's mostly grey tones. And this is the same principle that I used here. So I use the same technique with acrylic and oils. I use a slightly larger brush and slowly progress to a smaller brush. This was done using filberts, and I actually use filberts for a lot of my detail work as well, especially stiff synthetic filberts because of the curve in the blade, curve in the bristles. I'm able to get a really crisp line as well as a broad base, especially when you're creating chunky textured fur like bear fur or koala or basically any fur, especially if it's wet, how it's got a wider base that comes to the tip in quite a dramatic way. I use a wider brush like a filbert and I just flick it off the end to create that sharp tip rather than painstakingly painting every single hair, which I do see a lot of wildlife artists do, which is fine. It's just not very efficient when you have to churn them out. So that one might be really good to refer to if you want to. I've also got a set out here of my basic tones that I like to work with when it comes to my wildlife, whether it's tigers, lions, cheetahs, basically any animal that has remotely tanned fur, even white and black will get the same colour palette that I use. And so I've used, this is also from a workshop, I've created my basic shadow tones that I like to create, basic midtones, so the true value, what you'd get around the middle scale if you were to, there's a little sheet there as well. You're welcome to take photos of all of this, by the way, not a problem. And when you create a value scale and you look at the value tones that sit around the middle, that's what I tend to use as not only my blocking in, so creating those initial base tones to work from to get to know the artwork and build layers on top of. It's what I use for what I call my opacity layer, which is an opaque application of paint that I use as a base to glaze on top of. And especially with acrylic, you'll be glazing to create that blend of tone in your fur and your feathers to create the curve to the shape of the feather or the depth in the fur itself. That glaze is what is going to give you that easy tone from light to dark without having to fuss over frustrating mixes that just won't work because it's just not mixing properly. So I forget that completely and I use glazes. And I mean, most of the time my glazes are with darker tones because it's a lighter pigment or some specific term to do with the size of the pigment and the resulting transparency of the colour itself. And then I've got what I would use for highlights as well. So that is also probably something that would be really helpful. And I will just grab.
Excuse me, do you use those guide boards for every painting you do? So when you go to start something, do you do those, think, okay, I'm doing a tiger, I use all these colours, and you actually do a guide board before you start?
Not usually, no. A lot of the time, mostly that's only because of experience. I've done it for so many years that it's just off the top of my head, I know what I'm going to use. And my husband made a very good point when I first set out with my online tutorial platform. He's like, you don't know how to do the basics. You don't know how to show the basics because it's all in my head and I've done it for so many years. So what I've been doing now is creating these boards not only to solidify concepts that I've developed over the years, but so that other people can use them as well, because they are really helpful. And even though they seem simple in my head, when you actually put it out there and make it a logical system to follow, then yeah, it's really useful, not just all in my head. So I did a workshop where I did both acrylic and oil paint, just the blocking in layers, and they look exactly the same, to me anyway. These are just the original initial layers, and this was a comparison just between acrylic paint and the Maimeri Puro, both top of the range paints, and the difference between the two were so minute. It was more mostly in the working time. So a lot of people ask me why oils, why acrylic? And it has nothing to do with the difference in the quality of the image. It just comes down to personal preference. So I love how the oils look and I love how the acrylic look. And thankfully I can apply the same process across the board to both of them. So I referred to a grayscale value string or a color string. This is another, this is a lesson actually from another book which I recommend. I didn't even check with Leighton. This is another book that I highly recommend, The Oil Painter's Guide to the Oil Painter's Colour Handbook. This is something I refer to a lot now that I'm diving down the road of colour theory. It talks a lot about, well, basically everything to do with colours, and one of the exercises that they recommended was creating a value string or a colour string. And this one is also my favourite tones to use for creating wildlife fur and things like that, and sort of how to find it on the value scale if you have trouble with contrast, creating depth in your paintings. Creating something like this is really helpful. This is using the Munsell Colour Wheel, which is the name of an artist who created a colour wheel that separates paints based on their values and chromas. Yep.
So the bottom one,
yes.
Are they mixed colours or are they individual colours with that particular value?
Yeah. So when you create a colour string, which is this bottom one, different values based on a true value, so the middle range, you're creating darker versions of that and lighter versions of that. So whether or not you'll be adding another colour to it, so down this end I'm adding more burnt umber and burnt sienna to the base before it becomes black, and up this side I'm adding titanium white and raw sienna before it becomes almost pure titanium white right on the end of the scale. And there's a colour wheel called the Munsell colour wheel, and that has separated pigments and colours based on their value, as well as the intensity of that colour. So when you look on the Munsell colour wheel, you'll see what colours, so what paint, so it'll list whether it's burnt sienna, burnt umber in that specific range, and their value grade, so how dark or how light it will be. So it makes selecting what colours to add to create a shadow tone or a highlight really easy. A lot less guesswork when you use the old colour wheel. So yeah.
So do you spell that as muzzle?
Munsell, M-U-N-S-E-L-L. Munsell colour wheel. And so basically I feel like I have said everything that I had planned to say that's pretty much it for the workshop. Yeah, thank you everyone. Thanks so much for watching the workshop. Please see the description for all the links to my tutorial platform and the website for all the art supplies I used in the demonstration. Please subscribe, and if you would like to become part of the artist community here at Carla Grace Art, then I look forward to helping you take your art to the next level very soon.